Hi, everyone, and welcome to what I see from the source sheet is the 15th meeting of the 9 to 9, our monthly 9 to 9 meeting with Rachel Danziger. For those who are new to this class, because I do see some new faces here, the 9 to 9 project is a program that started in Israel about, 5 years ago, 4 years ago.
By now.
Yeah, so they are studying a parak of Tanakh, a chapter of Tanakh every day, and it takes of 929 chapters of Tanakh. And we have been going through Tanakh with Rachel, and we are now at the end of the book of Jeremiah. Just a really quick thing about Mayan upcoming programs. Tomorrow night, as you may have also seen, since you're here, we have a class, a pre-Pesach class with Rachel Slutsky, who's another one of our fabulous teachers. So I highly recommend block out 8:15 tomorrow. So you can see, if you need the link, you can send it to me. It would be really great if, it's kind of hard to get a participant list in what is it called? In Zoom. So we're really trying to capture whoever's coming to our classes. So if you're able to private message me in the chat window, you can send something to everyone if you have a question for Rachel or to share a thought as you're going. So if either you could write your first and last name and email would be great, so we can continue to send you programmings that we're going to be doing over the coming weeks, however long we're all stuck here, but Mayan's always offering classes. So if you could just send me either a private message or to everyone, whatever you want. If you're looking for friends to contact you, then send to everyone and someone will send you an email and say hi. And just give me basic information, name and email. And now let's let Rachel take it over.
Okay, thank you very much, Ilana, and welcome everybody for our 15th meeting. Yeah, can I ask that everybody mute themselves right now? And then I'm going to
mute everyone, and you'll be able to unmute yourself if you have something to say, and then I'll unmute Rachel.
Okay.
Okay, Rachel.
Okay, thank you. So we'll try and have some discussion later, but for now, just so we can hear each other, I'll be the only voiced one. That's an odd position to be in, but we'll make do. Welcome. It's really nice to see or not see or hear or sense the presence of many who've been with us in this journey for 15 times already, and many new faces, so it's a pleasure. And without further ado, let's jump right in. So Chekhov famously said, and we mentioned it a few meetings ago, actually in our 9 to 9 discussions, that if a gun appears in the first act of a story, the gun is bound to shoot by the last act. And when we talk about the monarchy in Jewish history, the first time where sorry, just a minute, I'm going to share screen with you. The very first time when, the very first time when the Hebrew Bible mentions the monarchy, it's already placing several smoking guns on the table, so to speak. It puts a lot of checks in places when it tells us in Deuteronomy that what to do when the people will want a king in Israel. And all those checks and balances create this image in our mind of something that we want, something that is desirable, something that will help us, but we should also be very wary about. And let's take a look at it for a second. Here in the box number 1, Chekhov's gun. If, after you have entered the land that the Lord your God has assigned to you, and taken possession of it and settled in it, you decide, I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me, you shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by the Lord your God. Be sure to set as king over yourself one of your own people. You must not set a foreigner over you, one who is not your kinsman. So far, all we see is just a condition that seems almost obvious, almost common sense. But this is where the story becomes more convoluted and where the warnings of the Bible become more pointed. We'll look at verse 16. Moreover, he shall not keep many horses or send people back to Egypt to add to his horses, since the Lord has warned you. You must not go back that way again. And he shall not have many wives, lest his heart go astray, nor shall he amass silver and gold to excess. When he is seated on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priests. Let it remain with him, and let him read it all his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, to observe faithfully every word of this teaching, as well as these laws. Thus he will not act haughtily towards his fellows, or deviate from the instruction to the right or to the left, to the end that he and his descendants may reign long in the midst of Israel. So the warning that a king might become haughty and arrogant and see himself as above his people is pretty obvious. I mean, anybody with any knowledge of any royal dynasty ever knows that it's a pretty likely scenario. The warning that a king may forget God and stray away from the Torah is also pretty obvious. But the warning that the king may send people back to Egypt seems a little bit bizarre. It's true that in the ancient Near East, a lot of horses came from Egypt, and a lot of the trade for horses passed through Egypt. But do we really think that a king will start resettling his people in Egypt, or take his people and move to Egypt? Why would a sovereign king do that? And if the fear is not about that, if the fear is just that the king will send people to go down to Egypt and bring horses for him, what's the big deal? So they go there. They go in a lot of places. Let them go in a slightly different road if it's really that literal about this particular road. What's going on here? Why is this such a warning? Why is this a smoking gun to be placed on the table this early on? So if we look more carefully at the things that the king is prohibited from doing, we can see that there's another layer to this warning not to go back to Egypt. Let's think about it together for a second. He is told not to collect many horses. What it really means, in a sense, is that he cannot have a standing army. He cannot have extended wars, and he cannot have forces enforcing his rule across a wide swath of land. When we say he must not amass gold and silver, it means that he cannot tax people excessively. He cannot strengthen his rule by, for example, conquering other lands and telling them, now pay me tribute, because he's not allowed to collect this kind of gold and silver. And when he's told that he cannot marry many wives, it means that he cannot acquire an empire by way of diplomatic marriages. He cannot consolidate his hegemony this way. So in other words, the king is not merely warned not to become haughty and disconnected from the people and see himself as above them. He is warned not to model himself on the kings that were the normal kings, let's put it this way, of the ancient Near East, those kings who aspired for empires and fought empirical wars and married extensively, let's put it this way, and worked very hard to consolidate their power and their hegemony beyond their natural borders. He is warned not to be like them. And the second we understand that this is really the hidden bite behind these bizarre instructions, it's easier to see that perhaps the warning not to go back to Egypt is not so much a literal warning, even though we will see later that it actually is. But for now, it's not so much a literal warning as much as it is a warning not to become like Egypt. Because our experience up to this point, which is up to Dvarim, Deuteronomy, with the kings of the Near East, our most extensive experience of looking at them, exploring them, and seeing them, was our experience with Paro, with visiting Egypt through first Joseph and then seeing what happens through the time of the Israelite bondage in Egypt, and dealing with that in Genesis and Exodus. So we're told, don't be like that. Don't go back to Egypt in the symbolic sense. And before we continue with that, especially seeing as we're about to welcome Passover next week, and the idea of Egypt and the idea of what it means to leave Egypt is in the air, so to speak, along with coronavirus, unfortunately. I I want to ask you, and let's see if we can make it happen, if we can make a discussion happen without talking over one another too much. What did we learn from our foray into Egypt? In other words, what should the Jewish king not be? What is Paro like that we saw in Genesis and in Exodus that the Jewish king is warned not to be? Would anyone like to venture a thought or an idea? Anyone? Yes, Esther.
Well, Paro, first of all, has enslaved people.
Mm-hmm.
Slavery. Imposed harsh conditions on those people.
Mm-hmm.
And sets himself up to be a god.
So Esther is mentioning three very important things. First of all, that the relationship between the king and the people below him is one of a slave driver and slaves, and one that it's not a nice treatment of those slaves, and third, that he puts himself on a godly pedestal. Correct. All of this is true. Any other thoughts? Any other impressions? Yes, Joyce.
Also, he's stubborn in the face of instructions from God.
Yes, this is a very important point. It will come into play a lot in the history of the Jewish king when the prophets lament that God is giving you instructions, why aren't you following them? And in that sense, it's true that they're becoming almost like Paro in the beginning of Exodus. Anything else? Any other thoughts? Let's think for a second about the other Paro, the Paro who did know Yosef, the Paro that Joseph met. What about his conduct? So he didn't treat everybody badly necessarily, and he wasn't so stubborn. When Joseph came and gave him ideas, he used them. Yes, Esther, you wanted to add something? You're mute.
What I was going to add is comparing the first Paro and the second, he uses Joseph's interpretation of dreams to do what is right for his community. Whereas when he is getting challenges from Hashem to do the right thing, he puts his community, not only the slaves that are other, but his own community, the Egyptians, at risk for the benefit of his own glorification. Or in light of his own stubbornness, cares not what happens to his people.
So do I understand correctly that you're contrasting the two Paros we encounter? Yeah. You're saying that the first, regardless of whatever bad things we can say about him, but he cares for his community. He does something for the benefit of the people he's responsible for.
He holds back food, but the food isn't necessarily for himself. He pays attention to the interpretation of his dreams, saying, okay, I have to hold not just enough for myself, but I'm holding for Egypt food for the famine.
That's a good point. That in a sense, the early Paro highlights the problems with the latter Paro, because even Paro, the grand king of Egypt, is capable of caring for his people. If we look for a second at the source sheet, just a moment, we'll come back to the discussion in a second. Sorry, it's just technically challenging for me, but here we are. Rabbi Soloveitchik, in his book Vision and Leadership, which focuses on Joseph and Moses, or a collection of articles that focus on Yosef and Moshe, talks about Egypt not as a place that's necessarily all bad. He does say that the Egyptian way of life is different, and that part of the idea of our enslavement in Egypt, the reason we had to go there was so that we would appreciate by contrast what we have. If you look here in box 2, the first source, why was the Egyptian crucible of pain and indignity necessary? God wanted the children of Israel to appreciate the code of Abraham. The clan could not become a great nation unless the children were ready to sacrifice. If every ethical system is just as good as a Torah, there is no need to make so many sacrifices for it. There is something exalted in Torah, but it is impossible to find from within. One must leave the house of Abraham and the house of Jacob for a while and come to Egypt. Regardless of that, he does point out that the Egyptian way of life, the very way of life that we're supposed to look at and see a contrast to what we're supposed to be, can go either way. It can go the good way or it can go the bad way. And the way Rav Soloveitchik interprets Paro's dream, the dream that causes Yosef to be brought from the house of bondage and interpret for him, is that Paro is really dreaming about the dual potential within civilization. Let's look here in the second part of this quote. Paro saw these beautiful cows devoured. The civilization of Egypt, in his vision, could produce wealth, plenty, pleasantness, beauty, prosperity, and security. But it also had within it satanic elements that wanted to destroy every institution to which the same Nile gave birth. Civilization, no matter how successful it is in its attempt to ease man's burden, is also capable of destroying him and everything for which he stands. Outwardly, the environment appears to be cooperative. Clandestinely, it is out to defeat man, to trample over him. Man pays the toll of the road. I have to say, these words resonate with me now more than they did when I read it originally a year ago. You know, that here we are with our exalted technology. Here we are sitting having a shiur with nothing but screens and other electronical things that I don't understand. But physically, it's just a screen between me and you, making it possible for us to sit here in some form of togetherness. And it's amazing, it's incredible. But the same civilization expands and expands and expands and brings us into contact with species of animals or locations or habitats we're not supposed to be in contact with, and brings into our life the thing that necessitates making this class online in the first place. So here we are experiencing both of those sides of civilization at the same time. And what Rav Soloveitchik says in the continuation of this same sentence, each discovery to the advantage of man makes the life of man more precarious than before. And he enumerates various options: pollutions, malignancy, the possibility of destroying life on our globe in a few seconds. What are they if not the 7 other cows? But Rav Soloveitchik says that the answer, unlike what some philosophers claim, is not to stop civilizing. It's not to go back to the caves of our distant forefathers. Sorry, it's not to go back to the cave. It's not to go away from technology. It's not to withdraw, but rather to continue civilizing, to continue building the world, to continue building our strength as people, but to do it in a moral, ethical way. And this is Yosef's message. Yosef's message, according to Rav Soloveitchik, when he interprets the dream, is not merely, it's not merely that to collect wheat for years of famine, but rather it is I'm going to read from the middle of the quote that's here in front of you. Men should take the risk. However, there is a limit to the civilizing gesture. Men should be creative, as long as he knows how to handle the blessings of civilization, as long as he does not get intoxicated with his accomplishments, as long as he is guided by a wise and moral policy, as long as he knows how to behave during the 7 years of prosperity, to enjoy modestly, to comply with the moral law pertaining to prosperity, a law which teaches him to share what he has with those who do not have. In other words, Egypt represents the risk, the danger, the horror that can be unleashed upon us through our own creative endeavors, but it doesn't have to be that way. So perhaps in Rav Soloveitchik's idea, we're supposed to learn from Egypt something, but it's not that Egypt is all bad, but rather that Egypt has this destructive potential and we need to learn to recognize it, and the Israelite king needs to learn to avoid this danger. However, other commentators and other Jewish philosophers disagree. And they say that the problems we see later in Moshe's Paro are already there in Yosef's Paro. But before I continue with that, I want to ask you, does any of you feel this way? Does any of you feel that perhaps there are deeper problems in Egypt that are not optional, or that there are problems already with the first Paro? Anyone? Just speak up, because I can't see everybody at once.
So connected to that, there's something that after, a few years ago I started reading it a little bit differently. When, well, it's true that Paro is worried about his land, and he has, Yosef set all this up. When you get to the end of the time of famine, or the middle of it even, what you have is everything is owned by the state, because people had to give large parts of their harvest to store for the lean years. And that grain was not just given back to the people who sent it in, or to, divided just evenly, but it was also enough to sell to people from outside Egypt. And in the end, it seems like Egypt had it sort of became what we think of as a medieval kind of system with the king owning all the land, and everything was owned by the state, and the people had less than when they started. So has always seemed a little strange to me that while Yosef achieved what he did, this was the system that they ended up with.
There's a certain opportunism here that, yeah, the king saved everybody, but he also took the opportunity to subtly use their misfortune to
enrich himself, or to enrich the state.
Sorry, Cheryl? Can't hear you, Cheryl.
Not into the technology here. No, I was just going to say that was really Yosef's idea, though. In other words, I mean, I see that really as more like Yosef kind of, and that's something that I find difficult to understand as well, but just, how he could do this to his own people and tax his own people and everybody else, and what kind of moral values, does that show? That this was his plan that he shared with Paro, and Paro thought was a brilliant idea.
Yeah, perhaps without Yosef, Paro would have simply let his people die, but Yosef definitely helped to build the house of bondage that later imprisoned his own descendants. There's a certain almost taste of midah keneged midah here, and I think it goes beyond our own history, that people often build the systems that end up limiting them, in a sense. There's a certain, you accept the bondage first, on some level, without seeing the consequences. In a sense, it goes back to Rav Soloveitchik says that by accepting this creative, accumulative streak of Egypt and saying, no, we can tame it, Yosef is taking the risk that maybe it won't be tamed and he will be caught up in it already, on some level. Yoram Chazoni, who I'm very fond of quoting, as anybody who ever been to my classes knows, so he's much harsher than Rav Soloveitchik on Yosef, and he says that in the philosophy of Hebrew scripture, he says that Yosef may appear to be successful in saving Egypt and his people and his own family, and he is on some level, but he is also enslaved. It's not only that his descendants are enslaved, Yosef himself is enslaved. And Chazoni points out that at the end of Yosef's story, when Yaakov dies, Yosef is scared of asking Paro for permission to go to Israel to bury him. Instead, he asks the people in the palace to intervene on his behalf. And Paro says, sure, you and your brother go, but leave your families here. We already see the foreshadowing of the later Paro, who will say, yeah, you can go pray for 3 days, but leave your children and your flocks here. You're not really free to go. And Yosef accepts it. In a sense, Yosef accepts the fear of Paro, accepts this feeling that he is under Paro's authority. And what happens later, the lashes, the bricks, the mortar, the slave drivers, this is merely a physical expression of a slavery that started on the inside earlier on. And Chazoni points out that Egypt in the Bible, but not only Egypt, also the great empires of Mesopotamia, they stand for a whole way of life that's founded on the principle that safety comes from a strong hierarchy, from a king that controls his people, from people paying their dues and receiving protection in turn, And anything that risks that, anything that might mean that the king will not have the power to protect you or won't have the desire to protect you when bandits come to take your grain from your fields, might lead to your death. So it's worth it. Accept it. Be afraid. Be scared. Be obedient, because it's all better than the alternative, than the chaos that comes otherwise. And if that's what we're afraid of, if that's what Paro and Egypt stand for, and if that's what the Israelite king is warned against when he's told not to go back to Egypt, we can understand better why, for example, when Shmuel was asked by the people to choose a king for them, he was so concerned. Because what is a king if not the person who has the most to gain from a strong hierarchy, who is invested in preserving the status quo, who can be blinded by his own power and lead the people into forgetting that there's certain truth, there's certain right and wrong values that stand beyond how successful their country is at protecting them or enriching them or amassing all those things that civilizations, in Rav Soloveitchik's interpretation, allow people to accumulate and build. And they become so invested in the status quo and their security and their prosperity that they'll forget their path. This is what scares the Moshe in Deuteronomy. This is what scares Shmuel generations later. And as we see in the Hebrew Bible, and we're not going to delay on that since we talked about that in previous meetings, but we'll just mention it briefly. Sorry, I keep not sharing correctly. Just a moment, sorry. And as we see later in the history, this fear, the fear of a king who doesn't physically go back to Egypt, but rather recreates the Egyptian way of life, i.e. a way of life that idolizes prosperity, security, strength, civilization over right and wrong and caring for the weak, for example. As you said in the beginning, Esther, one of the first things we know about the second Paro is the bad way he treats his dependents, both his people and the Israelites. So we do see that fear realizing itself. We see it realizing with Shlomo, who amasses horses and wives and gold and silver, and at first uses it to build this grand kingdom. We've never surpassed the grandeur of his kingdom, and build the temple and build a palace and build up all these institutions. But he does it to such an extent that his people reject him. His people can't stand the taxation. His people can't stand all the limitations he puts on them. And eventually he also ends up bankrupting himself because he overextends his credit with the other kings around him and ends up giving them parts of Israel and land because he can't pay them back. Because at first, everybody produced so much in Israel that they had surplus to give to other countries in return for all the wood and precious stones they needed to build the temple and other building projects. But then, because they had so much, they stopped producing. And then they ran out and they got depleted. And all of this grand thing he built collapsed on his son's head, because in his son's time, Yerovam from Shevet Ephraim came and said, lower the taxes, no taxation without representation in a sense. And when Rechavam, Shlomo's sons, refused, the kingdom tore in two. And interestingly, when the Book of Kings tells us the story of Shlomo and his tragic rise and fall, it uses mentions of Egypt in strategic places to kind of highlight that process. It keeps pointing out repeatedly that Shlomo married Paro's daughter. It keeps pointing out, if you look here at box 3 in the second source, in 1 King chapter 10, that he amassed vessels of silver and vessels of gold. And in verse 16, and Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen. And in verse 28, and the horses which Solomon had were brought out of Egypt. Later, Yerovam, the man who founded the northern kingdom of Israel, also ends up choosing prosperity, security, his narrow interests of keeping his power within his country over what's right, when he institutes state idolatry, when he basically builds new temples and new centers of worship so that the people wouldn't be attracted to go back and reunite with the kingdom of Judea. And he too, at a strategic point in the story, we're told, is connected to Egypt, because when he runs away from Shlomo in the beginning, if you look here in Kings 1, chapter 11, verse 40, Shlomo sought to put Yerovam to death, but Yerovam promptly fled to King Shishak of Egypt, and he remained in Egypt till the death of Shlomo. So with all of that in the background, we might conclude that when Deuteronomy warns us that the king should not have horses because it might lead him back to Egypt, to the road where God says, don't go down that road again, it's only symbolic. It's a purely symbolic fear, that what we're really warned against is not to be like Egypt, which of course aligns beautifully with the repeated refrain in Dvarim to treat the weak in the society well because we were slaves in Egypt, and to treat orphans well because we were slaves in Egypt, and to free the slaves in the 7th year because we were slaves in Egypt, etc., etc., etc. So it all aligns really beautifully. We could finish the class here and say, great, we're not supposed to go back to Egypt. Let's clap ourselves on the shoulder. We're not like Egypt. Great. Except that in Yirmiyahu, in the final chapters of Yirmiyahu, that smoking gun, Chekhov's gun from the first act, shoots quite literally, quite unsymbolically. Because what we see is that towards the end of Yirmiyahu's career, as he keeps warning the kings about what to do and they keep ignoring him, one bad decision after one bad decision after another bad decision end up leading the people all the way back to Egypt. Literal, physical Egypt, down the road where we're not supposed to go. In other words, the kings, the very kings we talk about in Deuteronomy, really do complete the arc that we're warned against in Deuteronomy. And what I want to do with the rest of the time we have, since it is a class about Yirmiyahu and not just about Pesach, when all is said and done, I want to look at some of those key moments in Yirmiyahu when a king makes a bad decision, when a king rejects what Yirmiyahu has to say, a king or a leader at a later point. And I want to look a little bit together with you at what is the nature of those bad decisions that end up leading us to Egypt, and what we can learn from them, what we can take from them as don't do that for ourselves. Yirmiyahu is Jeremiah, prophet Jeremiah, sorry. Here, let's look at, again, I'm trying to do this share business again. Let's look at one of those key moments. In Jeremiah chapter 36. Jeremiah has a student, disciple, scribe named Baruch ben Neriah, and he dictates to him a book in which he tells the Israelites where their things will lead, where their actions will lead, and that if they don't change their way, they're going to end up attacked by Babylonia and killed and exiled. And at the time, the king is Jehoiakim. Then Yirmiyahu asks Baruch ben Neriah, go and read out this scribe with these words by the temple in some official place. And the officials there, all the ministers who hear him reading it out, are terrified, and they go to the king, and the king calls, and the king says, bring it to me. And in the meantime, the ministers tell Baruch, who stood there reading it, go into hiding, you and Yirmiyahu. They already know that the king is not going to respond to it particularly well. Let's put it this way. So Yirmiyahu and Baruch are in hiding, and the officials of the king, people from the court, are bringing this book that Yirmiyahu dictated to Baruch and reading it out to him. And let's jump straight to verse 22 in Jeremiah 36 here. Since it was the 9th month, the king was sitting in the winter house with a fire burning in the brazier before him. And every time Yehudi read 3 or 4 columns, the king would cut it up with a scribe's knife and throw it into the fire in the brazier until the entire scroll was consumed by the fire in the brazier. Yet the king and all his courtiers who heard all these words showed no fear and did not tear their garments. Moreover, Elnatan, Delaiah, and Gemariah begged the kings not to burn the scroll, but he would not listen to them. the king ordered Jeremiel, the king's son, and Seraiah, son of Azriel, and Shelemiah, son of Adiel, to arrest the scribe Baruch and the prophet Jeremiah, but the Lord hid them. In Hebrew, the word that's used for what the king is doing is not cutting, it's tearing. He's korea, he's tearing the book, but he's not tearing his garments. And I want to ask you, what do you think the text is trying to point out to us by using the same word there, by saying he tore the scroll, but he didn't tear his garments? Any thoughts? Anyone? Yes, Esther.
It's like killing the messenger.
Mm-hmm.
You know, rather than rent his garments,
Mm-hmm.
tearing the scroll, he didn't like what it had to say, and rather than listen, he destroyed it. So tearing it is basically destroying the message, the messenger, because he wants Baruch and Jeremiah arrested. He's blaming the messenger and avoiding the message. Denial ain't just a river.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of Egypt, right?
Right.
Yes, Andrea.
One of the things that happens when we tear our garments is it's something that's usually done when you're so distraught about something that's more important than your own material possessions or your own appearance or thinking about your own ego, because whatever it is that's going on is bigger and more important than that in the moment. So the king has nothing that's, more important than his own garments, not even, this, act that he's doing to the scrolls.
Yeah, if we compare it to Purim, for example, I mean, we're on the heels of Purim now, even though it does seem like there's been 3 years between us and Purim. I don't know about you, but that's how it feels to me. But let's think back to it for a second. It constantly, repeatedly describes the garments of the king. And when Haman wants honor, he says, let someone who the king wants to honor wear the garments of the king. So it's not just a person tearing his garments in mourning or in resignation or as part of a fast. It's the king tearing his garments. So the king it's a big deal. It's saying, I'm humiliating. I'm accepting my humiliation. I'm showing humility. When the king of Nineveh heard Yonah say, in 40 days, Nineveh will be ruined, he tore his clothes and wore a sack and ashes. But when the king of Israel hears Jerusalem will be burned, he tears the messenger, as Esther said. And perhaps that reminds us a little bit of Paro, who rejects all the plague, rejects all the problems, rejects everything, and tries to hold on to his own dignity, which is a potent warning when you think about the comparison and what it might portend to the kingdom of Judea. But here we see a little bit that this Paro-like behavior, this Egyptian-like behavior, will contribute to our eventual descent back to physical Egypt. Does anyone want to add anything before we move to the next instance in this sad tragedy? Yes, Anne.
It seems like he is distraught in tearing, because he could just throw the whole thing in a fire. He's distraught, but he's distraught at the threat to his person and his hold on power. And so it's the tearing of the sefer in anger and throwing it in the fire is a preservation of his power and his prestige, and so I guess his clothing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Deborah. You're muted. Yes.
I don't know about other people, but I'm spending this weird period of time not only working and preparing, at least mentally, for Pesach, but I am going through piles of papers and separating things that need to be shred. So when you read how he had to cut it before he burnt it, there's a certain deeper level of destruction when he's shredding before he's burning. Like, he doesn't want anyone to pick up the pieces of what he's destroying. He really wants to, like, grind it to nothingness. It's not just turning away from Hashem. It's just denying the existence.
I think that you're both picking on something very important, on this kind of emotional undercurrent that the story here beautifully, instead of just telling us that the king was in denial, it just shows us that through that act of destruction, which of course, again, destruction is in the air. We're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. He's destroying the message that might save him from it. And I saw that Andrea asked in the chat that wasn't part of the reason that Yonah didn't want to go to Nineveh, because he thought that they will repent while the Jews don't, and it will reflect poorly on us, right? Was that what you were asking? Yeah. So, yes. So yeah, there's a certain, all those contrasts just highlight that the king here is not simply oblivious or even willfully ignorant. He is rejecting anything that might reflect badly on him, or that might require from him to, roll back his sleeves. Forget about tearing. Just roll back his sleeves and do something. He rejects it. And we see that even more, I think, in a later part, in a later part of the Yirmiyahu arc. We're going to skip on box 5 because we're out of time, so we'll skip straight to box 6. But before we read it, I need to give a little bit of an introduction, a little bit of a setting of the events. So King Jehoiakim dies, and his nephew, Tzidkiyahu, becomes a king. And Tzidkiyahu has a weird relationship with Yirmiyahu. Sometimes he seems to respect him, sometimes he ignores him, sometimes he abuses him. It's during Tzidkiyahu's time that Babylonia under Nebuchadnezzar becomes a real threat. And when Yirmiyahu keeps warning him and the people that if they continue conducting themselves the way they do, Bavel will come and destroy Jerusalem, at first Tzidkiyahu just ignores him. But then Tzidkiyahu's ministers come to him to complain. And they say there's this man, this prophet, who keeps telling us that the Babylonians are going to win, and they're going to destroy us, and they're going to burn Israel. He speaks against us, this damaging morale. Please let us imprison him or kill him. And the king is like, sure, do whatever you want. I'm not going to argue with you. Which is very interesting, because the ministers are coming in arguments that are sadly somewhat familiar to us, I think, saying things like, oh, it's bad for morale. The truths he's speaking are bad for our ratings. They're hurting the people's enthusiasm about being part of the kingdom. It's all these kind of, again, it's a more sophisticated form of tearing the scroll and not your clothes, of saying, my position is important, and therefore I'm going to reject whatever reflects badly on it. But then the weird thing is that Yirmiyahu is imprisoned. Babylonia, the army of Babylon draws closer, and Tzidkiyahu decides that he wants to talk to Yirmiyahu after all. So he sends to bring him from prison. And this is what happens. Let's read it here in Jeremiah 38. King Tzidkiyahu sent for the prophet Yirmiyahu, and the king said to Yirmiyahu, I want to ask you something. Don't conceal anything from me. In other words, he's saying, tell me the real truth. Yirmiyahu answered the king, if I tell you, you'll surely kill me. And if I give you advice, you won't listen to me. Yirmiyahu is already well versed in the experience of having his scrolls torn, to put it metaphorically and not metaphorically. Thereupon, King Tzidkiyahu secretly promised Yirmiyahu on oath, as the Lord lives, who has given us this life, I will not put you to death or leave you in the hands of those men who seek your life. Then Yirmiyahu said to Tzidkiyahu, thus said the Lord, the God of hosts, the God of Israel, if you surrender to the officers of the king of Babylon, your life will be spared, and this city will not be burned down. He's giving him a way out. You and your household will live, but if you do not surrender to the officers of the king of Babylon, the city will be delivered into the hands of the Chaldeans, who will burn it down, and you will not escape from them. King Tzidkiyahu has reservations. And at first he actually tells us what the reservations are. King Tzidkiyahu said to Yirmiyahu, I am worried about the Judeans who have defected to the Chaldeans, that they, the Chaldeans, might hand me over to them, to the Judeans, to abuse me. Not an unreasonable point, seeing as the Judeans who defected probably had full bellies against their king. But Yirmiyahu reassures him. He says, they will not hand you over. Yirmiyahu replied, listen to the voice of the Lord, to what I tell you, that it may go well with you and your life be spared. For this is what the Lord has shown me if you refuse to surrender. And he gives him a whole list of horrors. You can later go and look at it for yourself. But it comes down to this. They will bring out all your wives and children to the Chaldeans, and you yourself will not escape from them. You will be captured by the king of Babylon, and the city shall be burnt down. Now, we have a king who just received this horrific message, but also a measure of hope. He was told that there's a way out. The way out requires that he takes a personal risk. What's his first concern? What's his first response? Is he responding by being angry with Yirmiyahu, by killing him? Is he responding by saying, oh no, I'm too scared? Is he responding by saying, yes, I will be the hero, I will surrender and save the city? No. What's his first concern? Tzidkiyahu said to Yirmiyahu, don't let anyone know about this conversation or you will die. And then he sends him away and does nothing. In other words, Tzidkiyahu's first concern is to make sure that the party line is kept, that his opponents within Judea don't know about it, because if the ministers will know about it, they'll surely depose of him or hand him over to the Chaldeans themselves. So instead of taking the position of, I am going to take action one way or another, rejecting God's words or not rejecting God's words, he decides to do nothing. But his main concern, his main worry is that within the small petty power struggles within Judea, he will come, how would you put it? He will come down. He will go down in his approval, or whatever the terms are. I don't know. I'm not familiar with the American terminology for that. He will go down in his approval ratings, and perhaps his ministers will treat him not so well. So
In appearances.
in appearances, yes, and the clothes. But it's not just clothes. I mean, I think he's genuinely afraid that his minister will depose of him, or he'll stop being the king, or they will hand him over to the Chaldeans. He has a lot of legitimate fears here, but what's striking is that that's the first thing that he says. After trying to excuse his fear, the first thing that he says is, watch the party line. Don't let my appearance diminish in the eyes of the people around me. Forget about the city burning, forget about one empire conquering our country. That's all great, but right now, for however long we have left, I want to be on top within the hierarchy in Israel. Again, we see this kind of Egyptian spirit. We see Paro refusing again and again in the face of all these plagues that are tearing his country apart to preserve some appearance of dignity. But lest we think that the Hebrew Bible only condemns or critiques kings that are interested in their own personal image, the next case in the saga that takes us back to Egypt is actually not a king rejecting Yirmiyahu's advice, but rather Yirmiyahu's, the book, Jeremiah the book, records a case where a Jewish leader rejects rumors for what appears to be righteous reasons. And this takes place after the destruction of Jerusalem. In other words, after Tzidkiyahu rejects what Yirmiyahu had to tell him, after everything that Jeremiah told him will come to be, comes to be, the Chaldeans burn Jerusalem. They bring, they take most of the people of Judea into exile, but they leave a few back there, and they give them a leader, Gedaliah ben Achikam. And Gedaliah is a righteous man. He tries to restore the society. He can't do it in Jerusalem, but he does it in Judea. But he is also politically naive. Let's go down for a moment. When one of the generals, Yonatan, son of Kereach, comes to warn him, Gedaliah dismisses the warning. Let's look at Jeremiah 40. Jonathan, son of Korach, and all the officers of the troop in the open country came to Gedaliah in Mitzpah and said to him, "Do you know that King Baalis of Ammon had sent Ishmael, son of Netaniah, to kill you?" Interestingly, Ishmael, son of Netaniah, is actually a descendant of the house of David. In other words, the house of kings, the legitimate house of kings that are warned not to take us back to Egypt, their descendant is going to play, once again, a crucial role in taking us back to Egypt. But Gedaliah, son of Achikam, would not believe them. Jonathan, son of Korach, also said secretly to Gedaliah at Mitzpah, "Let me go and strike down Ishmael, son of Netaniah, before anyone knows about it. Otherwise, he will kill you, and all the Judeans who have gathered about you will be dispersed, and the remnants of Judah will perish." But Gedaliah, son of Achikam, answered Jonathan, son of Korach, "Do not do such a thing. What you are saying about Ishmael is not true." The Gemara, the sages in the Gemara say that Gedaliah didn't want to hear Lashon Hara. He wanted to not believe rumors without any, that are not substantiated, to not accept these bad words about somebody else. And because of that, he didn't listen. And when Ishmael came, he didn't protect himself, and Ishmael killed him. And then Ishmael killed a lot of other people and threw their bodies into a pit. And the wording in Jeremiah is weird because it says, and I'll read it in Hebrew. I brought it in Hebrew because the wording is important. "V'habor asher hashlich sham Ishmael et kol pigrei ha'anashim asher hika beyad Gedaliah." And the pit that Ishmael threw into all the cadavers that he hit in the hand of Gedaliah. And the Gemara asks, what does that mean? What does Gedaliah have to do with it? Gedaliah didn't kill them. If we look at Nidah 61a, did Gedaliah kill them? But didn't Ishmael kill them? Rather, since Gedaliah should have been concerned and cautious based on the advice of Jonathan, son of Korach, but Gedaliah was not concerned, the verse ascribes him blame as though he himself killed them. Said with regard to this prohibition against listening to malicious speech, even though one should not accept the malicious speech as true, one is nevertheless required to be concerned about the harm that might result from ignoring it. So we see here a case where it's not that the leader is concerned with his own dignity, with his own approval rating, with his own self-importance, with his own hierarchy. It's a king who's concerned with a principle. And he's concerned with the principle to the point that the principle blinds him to reality. The Gemara doesn't expect Gedaliah to agree to the plan to assassinate Ishmael without seeking evidence. But it says he should have at least been more careful. But he was not. So I want to ask you, and after that we're going to round it all up and finish, but I want to ask you, why do we see that also? I mean, we already saw all those kings. Why does Yirmiyahu, and it's important to note that Jeremiah doesn't play a role in this occurrence at all, but why does Jeremiah, despite not having a role here, why does the book Jeremiah include this story? Why is it important to this saga of our way back to Egypt, in your opinion? Any thoughts? Yes, Andrea.
It reminds me a little bit about when Samuel tells Saul that his problem was that he was small in his own eyes, that we have all these examples of kings that are too haughty, but this was a king who didn't understand that there are some politics involved in being king, and you can't just, you're not just the guy who gets to sit in the back of the room and be nice to everyone. It's you have to be paying attention to the possibility that there are also enemies and bad things.
Does that resonate with any other of you? I like this comparison to Saul, because I think Saul also, we see that he is too righteous in some ways. And then when he breaks completely. But he starts by being very righteous, very pure, very fixated on doing things the right way, and that he can't stand attention. He can't stand the compromises that are required. While David stands them very well. David constantly compromises, shenanigans, finds all kinds of creative solutions here and there, kind of out of the way. And in fact, the Tanakh constantly commends him for this dynamism. God constantly refers to David as the man who walked before me. Walk. which is a repeatedly positive word in the Hebrew Bible, from the Lech Lecha of Avraham, walk, to Shmuel described as someone who walks before me, David described as someone who walks before me, etc. So I think that there's definitely a certain kind of closing the circle of going back to the very, very first king before David and his dynasty. And there's a certain sad resonance here when David's descendant kills this leader. It kind of brings back the old drama between Saul and David. But I think that there's another, for the question of what takes us back to Egypt, I think that there's another layer that's happening here in this story, and that the book of Jeremiah would not be complete in the sense of it didn't include that, which is, and here, forgive me, I'm not going to become political in the sense that I'll tell you which party to vote for, but I will say something that can be interpreted as political, and make of it what you will. It's very easy when you're part of a political camp to notice all the problems in the other camp. It's very easy. You know, I see it constantly in the arguments about anti-Semitism, that people who are very identified with the Republican Party can easily point out all the problems of anti-Semitism on the left, in the campuses, and the anti-Israel movement, et cetera, et cetera. People who are very identified with the Democratic Party here seem to have a very easy time pointing out white nationalism, et cetera. People have a harder time, and I'm not talking about people like us right now, I'm talking about leaders, organizations, but of course it's important for us also. It's just that it's perhaps harder when you have actual power and you have to actually do something with it, in a sense. It's much harder to point out the problems in your own political camp. And I think that if the book of Jeremiah would have ended without the story of Taliah ben Achikam, we could say that he points out the political problems only in one political camp. He points out how people who are invested in a strong sovereign power ignore principles, reject ideas that threaten their place in the hierarchy. But what Yirmiyahu does by including also the story of Taliah is giving us also the other side of the equation and showing us that also people who are invested in ideology, in ideas, in values can become blinded to the reality of, yes, you are part of a hierarchy and a kingdom and a political reality. And by including that story, he shows us that the problem isn't necessarily only one type of leader, be it the leader who's invested in his own importance or the leader who's invested in an idea, but rather the problem is a leader who is so invested in one thing that his eyesight, his field of sight is narrow, or her field of sight is narrow, and they can't see beyond that, and they're blind to certain things. Esther, did you want to say something? Did you want to comment? Can't hear you.
It takes us nicely back to the quote from Deuteronomy. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to read a different translation because it actually gave more of a nuance. But it shall be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he has to write himself a copy. So not only, because this translation sort of says he can get it from the scribes, but in Everett Fox's translation, and I'm not good with the Hebrew, so that's why I stick to this because it's usually a little more close, he has to be as familiar with it that he can do it himself. To take the teaching of Torah and what you said in terms of both the ultimate power monger and the one who's naive, it goes back to not deviate from the instruction to the left or the right or the left, that it's that narrow bridge in between of having enough humility, but also understanding and listening and taking into account things and investigating. Don't be too humble that nobody's going to hurt you. So it goes back to where we started in terms of the piece in Deuteronomy of being familiar with Torah at both sides, not to become too enwrapped in your own power and not to deny the potential of problems if you don't pay attention. It's right there. I liked how it came back to that.
That's really beautiful, especially when the words left and right mean so much for us in that context.
Yeah.
And I think also now that you're saying that, I'm thinking about it beyond that also, that there's something very intimate about writing. It's the act of writing, especially the way that they did it then, which was not type on your email quickly, you know. It's intimate, it's physical, it requires working with your hands, it requires checking that you got the word right because you have to copy it exactly. It requires maybe sometimes taking a knife and erasing something that you did wrong or fixing your handwriting. This is a very time-consuming process to ask a king who has a lot of statecraft issues to deal with to engage in. But perhaps through that intimate process, he's supposed to see not only what the Torah requires from him, but also see the complexity. See that there's not black and white, that
And
there's
to be
not
fully engaged with all your senses, as you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. It kind of, it's, you know, we say shiv'im panim la Torah, right? There's 70 faces to the Torah. It can mean something very abstract, but it can also mean something very real, which is whenever you unpack a biblical passage, you can see different directions, different insights balancing each other out. And perhaps part of this process is supposed to birth something within the king, a certain encompassing look instead of a narrow, this is my party line, or this is what I believe in, and I will go this way. And I want to take us to the end of today's class from this point of being a person who's able to see more than one, either ideological or power-hungry, rating-obsessed perspective. The word Mitzrayim in Hebrew comes from the word narrow, sal. And indeed, there's a lot of commentary and a lot of writing about how Egypt is a place not only of evil kings and bad conditions for slaves and a house of bondage, but it's a place of narrowness. If we go back to Rav Soloveitchik and Yoram Chazoni, when Yoram Chazoni talks about how in Egypt, Joseph becomes afraid and starts tailoring his behavior to fit the Paro's expectations, then what we're seeing is a place where Joseph narrows his choices. He accepts this narrowness of his world. And later his descendants don't even have the ability to imagine an expansive world beyond that because they're already indoctrinated into slavery from childhood. And when Moshe comes and tells them, God says to leave, they're like, now you're adding work to us. What are you doing? You're breaking our status quo. Why are you doing that to us? And they're not too thrilled. So perhaps when back in Deuteronomy, where we're warned that a king might take us back to Egypt, we should look at it as a combination between the symbolic and the literal. In Jeremiah, what happens after Gedaliah ben Achikam is murdered is that the people ask Jeremiah, what should we do? And they say, really, really, we will do whatever you tell us to say. And if you look at the source sheet later, you'll see it's the last box. We don't have time to go over it now. You can see it for yourself. We'll do whatever you say. And he tells them, don't go to Egypt. Stay here. Babylonia is not going to enact revenge on you because Gedaliah is dead. And they say, no, 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 we have to go to Egypt. And they basically kidnap Jeremiah and Baruch ben Neriah and go to Egypt regardless and get lost there. Basically get assimilated, murdered, killed, persecuted. So the arc took us all the way to Chekhov's gun from the beginning. But perhaps that warning about kings in Egypt combines the physical, the fact that we might actually end up in Egypt, the symbolic, which is don't be like Paro as a leader, don't be an imperial king, and also something about your view of the world. Because maybe don't allow your heart to rise above your brothers is more than just don't be proud or have a strict hierarchy or something like that. Maybe it also means don't allow anything to blind you, to make you so fixated on your own importance or on your own ideals that you're unable to see that other people have points of view that are valid also, that other people have what to contribute to your country also, that other people have what to offer you. And perhaps this is, for me, something I can take from Jeremiah as we handle this unprecedented moment in human history. as we see both the grand and the horrible potential of civilization exploding in ways that a month ago I don't think we could fully imagine, and it continues to evolve. And as we prepare for Passover and for celebrating going out of the narrow spaces, out of Egypt, maybe we can focus on trying to think, how can we expand our points of view and ensure that as we deal with this reality, we don't become blind to part of it by being too partisan, by being too narrow-minded, by being too focused on our own ideals or values or structures. And with that, I want to wish you all a very happy Passover, a lot of health, God willing, and may we find healing for us and for our world. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, so much. That was really wonderful. Just a quick couple of more housekeeping just before you go. I just sent everyone a link to the registration page. We have in the past been asking for a donation of $10. If that's something you can do, it's always greatly appreciated. And just in general, Mayan's right now trying to offer all our classes for free. But if anyone's able to give a donation, either with a sponsorship of an entire class or even just anything you can give us, just helps us continue to offer great programming. Such as tomorrow night, we have Rachel Slutsky giving us a pre-Passover class on at 8:15 called Makat Bechorot and COVID-19, Ancient Models of Isolation in Times of Crisis. And then also, very out of character for Mayan, we are going to be offering a program on Chol HaMoed Pesach with Rachel Danziger. So we'll be welcoming her back again. And that class will be taking place on Monday, April 13th, the third day of Chol HaMoed at 8:15 p.m. That class is called The Exodus Showed Us God's Fingers. So why did we need the whole hand? So watch your email for information and the Zoom link for that class. And just as long as we're all stuck at home, we'll be offering classes. So keep an eye out for.
We're safe at home. We're safe at home.
You're safe at home. And you're ready to learn Torah. So we're here and offering Torah classes.